In the autumn of 1945, as the world celebrated victory and the return of soldiers to their homes, thousands remained behind barbed wire on foreign soil. Among them were women whose stories have been largely erased from the narrative of World War II's end. They were not soldiers, not spies, not war criminals awaiting trial. They were auxiliary personnel, nurses, communication specialists, and administrative workers who had served the German military machine. Now, as prisoners of war on American soil, they faced an uncertain future and an approaching winter that filled them with dread. The war in Europe had ended in May. By September, the machinery of demobilization was grinding slowly forward, but the question of what to do with female prisoners of war presented complications that military planners had not fully anticipated. These women found themselves in camps scattered across the American heartland, far from the devastation of Europe, yet isolated in a kind of limbo between war and whatever peace might bring. They had survived the collapse of the Third Reich, the chaos of capture, and the long journey across the Atlantic. But as the leaves began to turn and the first cold winds swept across the plains, a new fear took hold. The camps where these women were held had been constructed hastily, designed with the assumption that the war would end differently or that prisoners would be repatriated quickly. The barracks were functional but barely adequate for summer months. Heating systems were insufficient or non-existent. Clothing supplies were limited. Medical facilities were strained. The women knew what winter in the American interior could bring, having heard stories from male prisoners who had endured previous seasons. Temperatures could plunge well below freezing. Snow could pile high and last for months. Without proper preparation, the coming winter threatened to become another ordeal in a war that was supposed to be over. What makes this story remarkable is not the fear itself, which was entirely rational, but what happened next. In towns and communities near these camps, something unexpected began to unfold. American civilians, many of whom had sent their own sons and husbands to fight against Germany, who had lived through years of rationing and sacrifice, who had every reason to remain indifferent to the plight of enemy prisoners, began to act with compassion that defied the logic of war. This is the story of how ordinary Americans responded to the human beings they found behind the wire, and how small acts of decency during a harsh winter revealed something essential about the better angels of human nature, even in the aftermath of humanity's darkest conflict. To understand how these women came to be prisoners of war in America, we must first understand their role in the German war effort. The Third Reich, despite its rigid ideology about women's place in society, had been forced by the demands of total war to mobilize female labor on an unprecedented scale. While Nazi propaganda celebrated the German mother and homemaker, the reality of a multi-front war required women to fill roles traditionally reserved for men. By 1943, hundreds of thousands of German women served in auxiliary positions within the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine. They were signal operators, maintaining the communications networks that connected field commanders to higher headquarters. They worked as administrators, managing the enormous bureaucracy required to keep armies supplied and organized. They served as anti-aircraft auxiliaries, operating searchlights and range-finding equipment during Allied bombing raids. They were nurses and medical orderlies, tending to the wounded in field hospitals from North Africa to the Eastern Front. Most were volunteers, motivated by a mixture of patriotism, economic necessity, and social pressure. Some came from military families. Others sought escape from bombed cities or dead-end jobs in war industries. These women were not combatants in the traditional sense. They did not carry rifles into battle or participate directly in combat operations. Yet they were integral to the German military system, and when that system collapsed in the spring of 1945, they shared in its defeat. As Allied forces swept across Germany from both east and west, military and auxiliary personnel alike found themselves caught in the chaos of disintegration. Some attempted to flee toward American or British lines, fearing Soviet capture. Others remained at their posts until the end, following orders or simply having nowhere else to go. The treatment of captured German military women varied depending on who captured them and where. Soviet forces, operating in a climate of vengeance after the devastation inflicted on their country, often made no distinction between military and civilian women. The fate of German women in the East was frequently horrific. Those who fell into American or British hands fared considerably better, though their future remained uncertain. They were classified as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions, entitled to certain protections and standards of treatment, but the Allied nations had not planned extensively for large numbers of female POWs. The decision to transport some of these women to camps in the United States was made for practical reasons. Europe was in chaos. Housing millions of prisoners on the devastated continent, while simultaneously trying to restore civil order, repatriate displaced persons, and begin reconstruction created impossible logistical challenges. America, untouched by combat on its own soil, had the space and resources to hold prisoners until arrangements could be made for their eventual return. The women were screened for war crimes connections, classified, and prepared for transport. The journey across the Atlantic in late summer and early autumn of 1945 was disorienting. These women had spent years in a country at war, under constant threat of air raids, surrounded by destruction and death. Now they found themselves on transport ships, crossing an ocean toward a country that existed only in their imaginations through propaganda and rumor. Some had relatives who had immigrated to America in earlier generations. Others knew only what they had been told during the war. All understood they were going as prisoners to the land of the enemy. Upon arrival, they were transported to camps in rural areas, away from major cities. The locations were chosen for security and practicality. The camps used infrastructure originally built for German and Italian male POWs earlier in the war. For the women, the arrival brought a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. They were safe from the devastation of Europe, but they were prisoners, far from home, uncertain when or if they would return. The initial weeks were spent establishing routines, learning the rules of camp life, and adjusting to captivity in this foreign place. As summer gave way to autumn, the women began to understand their situation more clearly. The barracks they occupied were simple wooden structures, adequate for warm weather but poorly insulated. The clothing they had been issued was military surplus, serviceable but not sufficient for severe cold. Food was adequate but institutional. Medical care was available but limited. The American military personnel who administered the camps were neither cruel nor especially sympathetic. They had a job to do, and they did it by the regulations. But as the temperature began to drop and the first frost appeared on the ground, it became clear that the coming winter would test everyone's endurance. October brought the first real cold. Morning formations saw the women's breath forming clouds in the crisp air. The thin blankets provided seemed suddenly inadequate when temperatures dropped at night. The coal supplies allocated for heating were calculated by bureaucratic formulas that had not accounted for an unusually harsh winter or for the poor insulation of hastily constructed barracks. Camp administrators sent requests up the chain of command for additional supplies, but the military was in the midst of massive demobilization. Millions of American servicemen were being processed out of uniform. The focus was on bringing boys home, not on improving conditions for enemy prisoners. Inside the camps, the women organized themselves as best they could. Those with medical training looked after the sick. Those with experience in supply management stretched resources. They shared clothing, huddled together for warmth, and tried to maintain morale through small acts of mutual support. But there was only so much they could do with what they had. The wood stoves in the barracks consumed fuel quickly. The windows were drafty. The floors were cold. Some women had chronic health conditions weakened by years of war and poor nutrition. Respiratory infections began to spread. In the towns surrounding these camps, word of the situation began to circulate. The camps were not secret installations. Local civilians saw the supply trucks going in and out. Some had jobs at the camps or knew people who did. The guards talked. The military chaplains who visited the camps spoke with local clergy. Gradually, the people in these communities learned that behind the wire were women, many not much older than their own daughters, facing a difficult winter with inadequate preparation. The initial reaction was mixed. Some argued that these were the enemy, that they had served the Nazi regime, that they deserved whatever hardship they faced. The war had cost American lives. Sons and brothers from these same small towns were buried in Europe or the Pacific. Why should anyone care about the comfort of German prisoners? Others saw the situation differently. These were not the architects of the war. They were women, many very young, who had been caught up in events larger than themselves. To allow them to suffer needlessly seemed contrary to American values, contrary to the principles the war had supposedly been fought to defend. Churches became focal points for discussion. Ministers and priests wrestled with what their faith demanded in this situation. Love your enemies. Do unto others whatever you did for the least of these. The words took on concrete meaning when the least of these were sleeping in cold barracks just a few miles away. Women's groups in the towns began to talk about what could be done. They had organized rationing committees during the war, had knitted socks and rolled bandages for the Red Cross. They knew how to mobilize for a cause. The breakthrough came when a group of church women approached the camp commander with a proposal. They wanted to donate blankets, warm clothing, and other supplies to help the prisoners through the winter. The commander was taken aback. Regulations governed what prisoners could receive, and accepting donations from civilians created complications. But the women were persistent. They argued that the Geneva Conventions required adequate housing and clothing for prisoners. They pointed out that allowing prisoners to become seriously ill would create more problems than accepting some donated goods. They appealed to basic decency. The commander agreed to forward the request to higher authorities. While waiting for approval, the women in the towns began collecting. They went through their closets and found extra blankets. They gathered old coats and sweaters. They knitted new socks and mittens. They collected bars of soap and tins of food. The response surprised everyone. Even families who had lost sons in the war contributed something. It seemed that once people began thinking of the prisoners as individual human beings rather than abstract enemies, compassion found a way through. When approval finally came through, with conditions and restrictions, the delivery of the first supplies created an unusual scene. A convoy of civilian vehicles arrived at the camp gates, loaded with bundles wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The prisoners watched through the fence as boxes were unloaded. They had no idea what was happening. When the goods were distributed, many of the women wept. They had not expected kindness. They had prepared themselves for cold endurance, for hostility, for being forgotten. The fact that American civilians, people who owed them nothing and had every reason to resent them, had gone to the trouble of gathering these things left them shaken and grateful in ways they struggled to express. December brought heavy snows and temperatures that plunged below zero. The winter of 1945 to 1946 proved to be one of the coldest in years across much of the American interior. The donated supplies made a significant difference, but they could not eliminate all hardship. The camp still struggled with inadequate heating. Illness still spread through crowded barracks. But something fundamental had changed. The prisoners no longer faced the winter alone. What had begun as a one-time relief effort evolved into ongoing contact between the camps and the surrounding communities. Local women organized regular collection drives. A church auxiliary made it their mission to ensure each prisoner had at least one decent pair of warm socks. A quilting circle produced dozens of quilts. High school students organized a drive to collect old books and magazines to help the prisoners pass the long winter evenings. These were small gestures in practical terms, but their psychological impact was profound. The military authorities, initially wary of civilian involvement, came to see the benefits. The improved morale in the camps made them easier to administer. Sick call numbers decreased as prisoners had better protection against the cold. The goodwill generated in local communities created a buffer against potential problems. Regulations were carefully followed. All donated items were inspected. Contact between civilians and prisoners remained strictly controlled. But within those constraints, a form of humanitarian bridge was built. Some of the most moving moments came during the Christmas season. Christian women in the towns felt strongly that the prisoners should have some recognition of the holiday. After much discussion with camp authorities, arrangements were made for Christmas packages to be prepared. Each prisoner would receive a small box containing a few simple items: a bar of good soap, a pair of warm socks, some hard candy, perhaps a small devotional booklet or Christmas card. The women who packed these boxes often included brief notes, carefully worded, expressing simple human goodwill. On Christmas Eve, the packages were distributed in the camps. Many prisoners had not expected to observe the holiday at all. The packages themselves were modest, but what they represented moved recipients deeply. Here were women in America, strangers who spoke a different language and belonged to the nation that had defeated Germany, taking time during their own holiday celebrations to remember prisoners behind wire. Some of the German women kept the cards they received for years afterward, treasured reminders that even in the darkest circumstances, compassion could cross boundaries that war had created. The winter tested everyone. There were nights when the cold was so intense that women huddled together in layers of donated blankets, sleeping in their clothes and coats. There were days when fuel supplies ran critically low and barracks became barely habitable. There were outbreaks of flu that taxed the medical facilities. But they endured. The combination of their own resilience, the basic provisions maintained by the military, and the supplemental support from local civilians saw them through. As the weeks passed, something else developed alongside the material aid. A few of the American women who had been most active in organizing relief efforts received permission to visit the camps under supervised conditions. The meetings were brief and formal, conducted through interpreters, but they allowed for human connection. The American women saw that the prisoners were individuals with families and stories and fears just like their own. The German women saw that Americans could be generous and kind, that they were not the caricatured enemies of propaganda. These encounters did not erase what had happened in the war. They did not resolve the complex questions of guilt and responsibility. But they demonstrated that humanity could assert itself even in situations structured by conflict and control. The women on both sides of the wire found they could recognize each other's common humanity without denying the reality of what had occurred. When spring finally arrived in 1946, melting the last of the winter snows, the atmosphere in the camps began to shift. Plans for repatriation were being finalized. The women would be going home, back to a Germany they had not seen in months or years, a Germany utterly transformed by defeat and occupation. They felt relief at the prospect of return, anxiety about what they would find, and something else they had not anticipated, a complicated gratitude toward the place that had held them captive but where strangers had shown them unexpected kindness. The repatriation process began in late spring and continued through the summer. The women were processed, given their travel documents, and prepared for the journey back across the Atlantic. As they departed, many asked if they could write letters of thanks to the communities that had helped them. Camp authorities carefully managed this process, but some correspondence was permitted. The letters were simple and heartfelt, expressing appreciation that transcended the barriers of language and recent history. For the American communities that had extended help, the departure of the prisoners marked the end of an unusual chapter. Many of the women who had organized relief efforts spoke about the experience for the rest of their lives. It had challenged them to think about what their values meant in practice, to act on principles of compassion even when it would have been easier to remain indifferent. Some maintained that helping former enemies was an important part of building a different kind of future, one not simply defined by the cycles of vengeance and bitterness that had led to 2 world wars in a generation. The women who returned to Germany carried memories of their imprisonment that were more nuanced than might have been expected. They told stories of hardship and uncertainty, but also of surprising kindness. They described the cold and the fear, but also the warmth of donated blankets and the generosity of strangers. These stories spread quietly through families and communities in Germany, adding a small but significant thread to the larger tapestry of post-war understanding between former enemies. The broader historical significance of this episode lies not in any dramatic turning point or major policy change, but in what it reveals about moral choices in the immediate aftermath of conflict. The women in those American towns faced a decision about how to respond to the humanity they recognized behind the wire. They could have chosen to look away, to remain indifferent, to let bureaucracy handle everything. They chose instead to act on compassion, even when it was complicated, even when some neighbors disapproved, even when there was no requirement or expectation that they do so. This story also illuminates a lesser-known aspect of World War II's conclusion. The end of the war did not mean the immediate end of all its consequences. Millions of displaced persons, prisoners of war, refugees, and survivors of concentration camps remained scattered across Europe and beyond. Their stories of struggle and survival, of suffering and occasional grace, continued long after the victory parades ended. The German women POWs in America were a tiny fraction of this vast humanitarian crisis, but their experience was part of the larger challenge of how to reconstruct human dignity and social order from the ruins of total war. In the decades that followed, some of these women maintained contact with Americans they had encountered, through letters or occasional visits. The relationships were never simple or without tension. Too much history stood between them for that. But they existed, these fragile connections across old battle lines, and they suggested that even conflicts as absolute and destructive as the Second World War could not entirely destroy the human capacity for recognition and care. The legacy of that winter is preserved in scattered memories, a few archived letters, and the recollections of now-aging children who remember their mothers organizing blanket drives for German prisoners. It is not a story that changed the grand sweep of history. The Cold War followed. Germany was divided. The post-war order took shape according to forces far larger than the interactions in a few prisoner-of-war camps in the American heartland. But for the individuals involved, the winter of 1945 to 1946 mattered profoundly. It demonstrated that ordinary people, in circumstances shaped by war and hatred, could choose to act on better principles. It showed that compassion did not require forgetting or minimizing what had happened, but it did require seeing the human beings in front of you and responding to their need. It reminded everyone involved that values mean little unless they guide action, even when such action is complicated or controversial. As the last of those who lived through those events pass from living memory, the story itself becomes a kind of testament. It asks those who encounter it to consider what they would have done, how they would have responded, what principles would have guided their choices. In that sense, the story continues to matter, not as history safely filed away, but as a question each generation must answer for itself when faced with the suffering of those designated as enemies or outsiders. The German women who feared winter in 1945 survived, in part because American locals stepped in. That simple fact contains layers of meaning about human decency, moral courage, and the possibility of building bridges across the deepest divides. It is a small story within the enormous catastrophe of the Second World War, but it is one worth remembering precisely because of what it says about the choices available even in the darkest times.